thanks very much for the invitation to speak. I'm really delighted to be doing this. And I do hope that the internet will hold. That's clearly the big disadvantage of this sort of long distance Zoom calling that we're doing here. I'm going to stop my video so that I can preserve some of sort of my phone here and begin my talk. So my lecture today is entitled Constructing a Heterotopia and Training the Tourist Gaze, the German Spa in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The image that I chose is of the princely palace in Brückenau in the 18th century, located in the territory of Prince Bishops of Fulda, and today located in Bavaria, or rather Franconia. In many ways, this image epitomizes one of the fundamental limitations or even contradictions of the early modern and 18th century spas. While the princely palace at Brückenau is built in the same style as the surrounding spa buildings, its position is elevated and thus symbolizes the prince's status at his spa, a visual contradiction between a call for equality on the one hand and social distinction on the other, that fundamentally marked all 18th century German spas. So in my lecture today, I've decided to try and provide you with a brief overview of my forthcoming book. Could you put on the next slide, please? Thank you. The German Spa in the long 18th century, a cultural history. The title of my lecture summarizes the two main arguments of my book, namely that the 18th and early 19th century spa was constructed as a heterotopia in the spa discourse, and that the spa discourse played an important role in training a tourist gaze that we are still engaging in today. My interest in this topic was actually created many years ago, about 20 actually at this point, when I realized that the 18th, there were a lot of sort of spa guides, different kinds of spa publications that talk differently about spas than most of the publications that I had read on the earlier centuries, the 16th, 17th centuries. And that those talked a lot about spas and entertainment facilities and the surrounding landscape and social interactions. And I got curious about why that is. And so I begin my book with a quote from Christoph Wilhelm Hufeland's Praktische Übersicht der vorzüglichsten Heilquellen Deutschlands. Could you, next slide, please? Of 1815, that is an example of the kind of source I stumbled across. Hufeland wrote about Pyrmont. It is one of the most popular spas, and the upper and richest classes visit it regularly. The way of life is naturally boisterous, luxurious, expensive, and grand, and therefore often constraining and oppressive for the lesser estates. One may hope, however, that this will fade out and people will finally realize that one main appeal of these institutions is and should be to step out of the ordinary conditions and rigid restrictions of civil life, so that for once one may enjoy in the open air the freedom of life and find delight in pure nature and its gifts in a natural way. So why did a physician writing a book about healing waters, and Hufeland, in contrast to many other publications I analyze in my book, actually writes mostly about healing waters, feel compelled to comment on the social atmosphere and the natural surroundings of a spa? Next slide, please. In my book, I show that 18th and early 19th century German spas served a vital role as spaces where new ways of perceiving the natural environment and conceptualizing society were disseminated. Although spas continued to be places of health and healing, their function and perception in Central Europe changed fundamentally around the middle of the 18th century. This transformation of the role of the spa occurred in two ways. First, the spa popularized a new perception of the landscape with a preference for mountains and the seacoast, forming the basis for the cultural assumptions underlying modern tourism. And second, contemporaries perceived spas as meeting places comparable to institutions of Enlightenment sociability like coffee houses, salons, and Masonic lodges. Spas were thus conceived as spaces where the nobility and the bourgeoisie could interact on an equal footing, thereby overcoming the constraints of early modern social boundaries. These changes were negotiated through both personal interactions at spas and an increasingly sophisticated published spa discourse. My book thus shifts the focus from the medical aspect of spas to their cultural and social functions, an interest that I believe I share with your research project on the European spa as a transnational public space and social metaphor. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce you to the main arguments of my book in 5 steps. First, I'll give you a brief introduction to the historical background of my study. Second, I will briefly discuss my methodology on primary sources. Third, I will introduce the German spa as a center of communication, an aspect that I regard as vital for the spa's role in disseminating ideas about the tourist gaze and social equality during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Fourth, I will talk about the spa's role in promoting a new perception of nature. And fifth, I will discuss the spa as both a discursive space for bourgeois demands for social equality and as an actual meeting place. Next slide, please. Historical background. I'm sure that everybody who's attending this Zoom meeting is familiar with the basic outline of the development of spas and balneology since the Middle Ages, among others, the shift from the bathing to the drinking cure. So I'm not going to go into that. I would like to emphasize, however, certain characteristics of 18th century German spas that were important to recognize when thinking about the cultural history of spas in that era. Next slide. The creation and promotion of spas in the 18th century were not determined by geological conditions or curative powers in a modern sense. While it cannot be denied that the age of the so-called scientific revolution led to a surge in scientific and medical knowledge and resulted in considerable advances in the chemical analysis of healing waters, the healing power of spa waters was still primarily a matter of successful attribution and social consensus, even at the beginning of the 19th century. Spa guides and other works commissioned by German princes to advertise the spas in their territories attributed a wide variety of curative powers to these healing waters. In the most extreme cases, healing waters were ascribed to spa waters, later shown to be ineffective or even harmful. Next, please. Nevertheless, spas like Lauchstädt and Wilhelmsbad were sufficiently successful in the late 18th and early 19th centuries that they continued to be included in spa guides and travelogues published in the early 19th century. The architectural ensembles of these spas are preserved today because they stopped attracting visitors later in the 19th century. And I was just trying to sort of juxtapose here the 18th century images and sort of my photographs. Although I realized that in Wilhelmsbad, I did it from the opposite angle, but I think you can see that they're fully preserved. All in all, therefore, many therapeutic water springs never became spas, and not all spas had curative springs. The established definition of a spa required a water spring that was marketed as a healing water, but the success of a spa was determined by its reputation, itself the result of a complex combination of assumed health benefits, advertising and presence in the print media, a resort-like space offering various leisure activities, and as a result, an increasing number of spa visitors from the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Next, please. The changes in the development and hierarchy of spas during the early modern period and the 18th century are highly significant. The spa map of early modern Central Europe reflects the shift in spa treatments from the bathing to the drinking cure over the course of the 16th century. Hot springs like Aachen, Baden-Baden, Ems, Wiesbaden, and Wildbad were leading spas in the Holy Roman Empire at the beginning of the early modern period. With the growing popularity of cold mineral waters and the drinking cure, Schwalbach or Langenschwalbach quickly turned into a highly successful spa. The 30 Years' War resulted in a general decline of the spas. Nevertheless, the spa tradition of the early modern empire continued after the war. Between the late 17th and the early 19th centuries, spas expanded almost without interruption, although the 7 Years' War and the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars left their mark on different spa regions at different times. For example, the success story of Aachen came to an abrupt end with the French occupation from 1792, 1794 onward. The rise of the spas in the 18th century found its first expression in the architectural redesign of existing spas. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, new spas then emerged at a rapid pace. Therefore, the spa hierarchy and spa map of the long 18th century look very different from those of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Karlsbad and Pyrmont were at the top of the 18th century hierarchy of German spas, followed by Schwalbach, Aachen, and Lauchstädt, with many middling spas also gaining a super-regional audience. Most 18th century spas depended on continuous support from the local prince. The spas' role as early tourist spaces in the late 18th and early 19th centuries then laid the basis for the exponential growth in the number of guests at some spas from the second decade of the 19th century onward. Spas like Baden-Baden, Ems, and Wiesbaden that were only middling spas during the 18th century thus rose to international fame in the 19th century. Next, please. As my book focuses on the role of the 18th century German spas as a multiplier of cultural and social ideas, rather than the development of one or more individual spas, my sample was determined by the representation of spas in 18th century German language print media. A spa's presence in the print media functioned as an indicator to determine which spas contemporaries encountered in their reading materials and would therefore have considered fashionable. A secondary geographical criterion was applied to the sample of spas, focusing on what contemporaries defined as German, or rather in German at the time, Deutsche spas. In this way, about 80 spas and seaside resorts were identified that made up the map of fashionable German spas in the long 18th century. Roughly 40 spas were represented in the print media for an extended period of time over the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries. They were at least of regional significance and sought to establish themselves among spa visitors through super-regional publicity. These spas constituted a small minority among the broad spectrum of healing springs in the early modern period and the long 18th century, which included numerous springs that sold their mineral waters but did not function as spas, and many spas that attracted only local visitors. Next, please. Thank you. These 40 spas cover an area stretching from Aachen in the west to Bohemia in the east, and from Freienwalde in Brandenburg in the north to the Black Forest in the south. And I have to explain that the circle here is a bit inaccurate because it does include the spa surrounding Dresden, and that's actually not quite correct. So next slide, please. So the roughly 40 additional spas that you see here, some newly founded, garnered super-regional publicity at the beginning of the 19th century. These included rural spas in areas such as the Giant Mountains, the Riesengebirge in Silesia, Saxon Switzerland, the Sächsische Schweiz, and the Renntal in the Black Forest, as well as seaside resorts on the Baltic and North Sea coasts. Next, please. Second, my methodological approach and primary sources. I define my book as a cultural history because I'm interested in the history of perception and the collective production of meaning. My cultural history of spas, therefore, analyzes how contemporaries viewed spas, and there can be no doubt that they saw them as leisure spaces. Next, please. In 1789, the Journal des Luxus und der Moden remarked, quote, "In our time, the spas are considered and visited by most people as places of pleasure. So for them, balneotherapy is a mere luxury. Their intention is merely to go on a pleasure trip, to meet friends, to dance, to play, to amuse themselves, etc." Authors even went so far to argue that visible illness was undesirable at a successful spa. In fact, at the late 18th and early 19th century spa, leisure activities and medical treatments, pleasure and work, noble privilege, and the bourgeois demand for equality combined in various ways. People made professional contacts, met friends, and made new acquaintances. The spa also functioned as a marriage market and provided an opportunity to consume art, fashion, and other luxury goods. Next, please. I therefore argue that Michel Foucault's concept of heterotopia aptly describes spas and their function in late 18th and early 19th century society. Next, please. According to Foucault, heterotopias are places in a society constructed as mirrors to everyday spaces. They are, quote, real places, places that do exist, which are something like countersites, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which the real sites, all the other real sites that can be found within the culture, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted, end quote. Contemporaries recognized and defined this specific intermediate position of the 18th century spa as a heterotopia. They just described this with a different terminology. On the one hand, the spa was characterized as paradise, Arcadia, Elysium, or even an enchanted island. And they didn't mean the islands, they actually meant the spa. On the other hand, it was described as the world in miniature. The spa was outside the world and yet reflected the world. From the middle of the 18th century, the spa became a heterotopia of compensation by multiplying cultural and social ideas of the Enlightenment. The spa thus offered an alternative space that, at least at first glance, seemed to be better than social reality. This defined space was also associated with a defined period of time, a heterochrony, the annual spa visit of 3 to 6 weeks that became more and more common among the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Next, please. I focus on two main groups of primary sources. The first main group of sources consists of printed texts from a wide variety of authors and genres, from spa guides and travelogues to plays and didactic poems. The titles of all these works bear witness to the fact that they deal with one or more spas beyond a purely chemical or medical analysis. These texts describe the spa as a place of social encounter and recreation, thus explicitly addressing spa visitors. Articles and reviews in journals are important sources, especially the regular Badechronik, Spa Chronicle, in the Journal des Luxus und der Moden. All these publications offered a wide range of information about the spa, from travel arrangements, the landscape surrounding the spa, accommodations, amusements, and services of all kinds to health benefits. Spa guides often contained engravings depicting the interior spaces or the surrounding landscape of the spas, or maps of spa regions. Intermediality was thus an important factor in persuading readers of spa guides to trust an author's claims about a spa. The second main group of sources are personal narratives, or as they are known in Europe, but not in the United States, ego documents, diaries, letters, and autobiographies that serve to compare the experiences of individual spa visitors to the published discourse. While I firmly believe that all personal narratives were and are embedded in contemporary discourses, they nevertheless offer the historian insights that printed sources cannot. In contrast to the often anonymous discourse, personal narratives allow us to access the perceptions of individuals whose social status and previous life experiences influenced how they responded to what they witnessed during spa visits. Next, please. The spa is a center of communication. The spa is an 18th century heterotopia, together with its inherent tensions, like those between its function as an aristocratic space of political and social representation and the bourgeois demand for equality, was created through a multi-tiered communication system. The direct face-to-face interaction of two spa guests formed the innermost circle of communication, spreading out to various overlapping communication circles between groups of spa visitors. Meetings and circles of friends in and around the spa extended this communication system. Letters written by guests to family and friends tied the spa into an even wider communication network. Next, please. During the 18th century, spas also became communication centers for Freemasons, as is evidenced, for example, by the hints that Gottfried Ephraim Lessing leaves in his Ernst und Falk. Some spas even established their own Masonic lodges. Moreover, secret political negotiations were often conducted at spas. In addition to these interactions, inherently defined as private and confidential, the communication structure of the spa was characterized by diverse interactions in the public spaces of the spa, especially along the main avenue, in assembly rooms and in coffee houses. These different types of communication, from confidential to public, often mixed, either intentionally or unintentionally. At the spa, an extraordinarily high degree of social interaction and networking took place in a dense space during a condensed period of time. Next, please. This situation sometimes created severe tensions between expectations of confidentiality and the disclosure of supposed secrets to the public. For example, during the Masonic Congress of Wilhelmsbad in 1782. Next, please. Beyond these forms of interpersonal communication, the concept of the spa as a heterotopia was conveyed to the reading public through the various formats and genres of writing that constituted the published discourse. In the 16th and 17th centuries, spa publications centered around health and disease. A gradual change occurred in the late 17th century and accelerated during the 18th century. From the 1770s onward, the published discourse diversified dramatically. Tourist spa guides emerged, advertising the spa as a place of leisure and social interaction. During the late 18th and early 19th century, spa publications reached a wider audience and allowed readers to keep abreast of updates on individual spas as well as debates in the spa discourse. By the early 19th century, knowledge about spas had become so widespread in contemporary society that authors could use spa references to generate satire. For example, in his novella Dr. Katzenberger's Badereise, first published in 1809, Jean-Paul relied on his readers' extensive knowledge about spas to evoke an entire tableau of spa experiences. Next, please. Fourth, the spa's role in promoting a new perception of nature. As a spatial heterotopia, the spa served as a multiplier of new perceptions of the natural and built environment that laid the foundation for the modern tourist gaze. Next, please. Until the middle of the 18th century, the ideal spa was in a town or city. In line with contemporary perceptions of civilized and wild spaces, the spa had to be an urbanized space, surrounded by a tamed landscape with substantial evidence of human cultivation. While healing springs could be found in different kinds of landscapes in early modern Central Europe, from rugged mountains to lowland plains, a spa needed to attract visitors to be successful. Therefore, spa guides sought to interpret a spa's interior space and surrounding landscape for prospective guests, either playing up its urban character and the cultivated fields and gently rolling hills around it, or playing down its supposedly untamed and rugged surroundings. Next, please. And these are two examples of maps from advertising guides, spa guides. And the point, of course, is that Aachen is an imperial city, so the spa district in Aachen is actually part of the town, and it's easy sort of to advertise that as an urban environment. Whereas Karlsbad is obviously with surrounded by quite high mountains, and so there was always an attempt at that time to emphasize the urban space of Karlsbad rather than show exactly where it was located. Next, please. Before the 1770s, nature entered the interior space of a spa only in a very limited fashion in the form of tree-lined avenues and French gardens. Next, please. And this is just one example, an early one of Boll with its sort of French garden that you can see right at the top, and all the tree-lined walks. Next, please. In the 1780s, however, the interior spaces of German spas changed considerably, in line with the transformation of formal French gardens into English landscape gardens. These gardens sought to recreate the natural landscape and transform spas into rural spaces. An ideal spa was now expected to offer an avenue and a landscape garden. Hirschfeld, in volume 5 of his famous Theorie der Gartenkunst, published in 1785, and numerous spa guides, stated that while an avenue was seen as a space for social interaction, landscape gardens provided walkers with a choice to be either alone or in company. 18th century spas thus multiplied Enlightenment ideas about landscape gardens as spaces that symbolized freedom. At the same time, spas sought to attract visitors by offering urban amenities and leisure facilities. An ideal spa provided spaces for reading, dancing, gambling, and dining. It had a coffee house, a theater, a bookstore, a casino, and more. It provided pump rooms, facilities for drinking the healing water as part of the spa's morning ritual, and bathhouses. Next, please. And these are just two examples to show you what sort of middling spas tried to do to fulfill these requirements. On the left is Bertrich, which tried to build leisure facilities along a very narrow strip of land along the Usbach. And on the right is Bocklet, that actually crammed sort of 4 tiny landscape gardens between its avenues. So there were some interesting ways to do this. Increasingly, writers called for spas to be more rural, but during the 1780s, the prevailing consensus was that spas could successfully merge urbanity and rurality, art and nature, to become perfect spaces for leisure. The 1780s thus constitute a transitional period in terms of the concept of the spa as a spatial heterotopia. High and rugged hills and mountains were still regarded as undesirable, and spa guides continue to emphasize a landscape ideal of, quote, meadows and pastures dotted with cattle, as Marquard wrote in his description of Pyrmont in 1784. Spa visitors were rarely encouraged to leave the confines of the spa, and if nature walks in the surrounding countryside were offered as a possibility, they were still described as wild. Next, please. The expanding spa discourse of the 1790s and the early 19th century caused a shift in the expectations of the surrounding landscape. The spas played an important role in gradually popularizing the new landscape perception, often labeled in shorthand as the discovery of the Alps, that some members of the elite, like Albrecht von Haller, had already begun to embrace in the first half of the 18th century. The published spa discourse thus became an important multiplier of the appreciation for mountainous regions, which were now described as wildromantisch and sublime. Spa guides were instrumental in propagating this new perception of nature to a wider public. Many spa guides of the time read like manuals on how to see and feel differently about the landscape. In short, they trained the tourist gaze. Spa guests were encouraged to leave the confines of the spa now, and not only to walk, but also to hike in nature. Over time, this fundamentally changed the perception of a desirable tourist area and desirable leisure facilities, activities. In consequence, contemporaries' attitudes toward individual spas also shifted. Karlsbad was a striking example of a spa that successfully redefined itself from an urban space to a rural retreat situated in a narrow valley with magnificent cliffs, a complete reversal of the early modern spatial ideal of the spa. Capitalizing on the surrounding landscape, a new group of spas in the mountainous regions of Central and Southern Europe, especially in Saxon Switzerland, the giant mountains in Silesia and the Black Forest, thus entered the collective consciousness of German spa visitors. Next, please. For example, in 1805, an article in the Journal des Luxus und der Moden commented on the transformation of the spatial heterotopia of the spa and the resulting changes of the German spa map. With an ironic undertone, the anonymous author observes that the new spas in Saxon Switzerland came into being because enterprising Saxons wanted to attract spa guests from Dresden who otherwise visited the Bohemian spas. Quote, where only nature revealed some mineral content in the springs that burst forth here and there, where one could hope that the charming region, even more than the healing powers of the spring, would attract spa guests. A new spa was created, and it is the charming region we have to thank for the creation of Tharandt and Schandau, which have flourished so quickly. Next, please. And I just wanted to show you real quick sort of the change in the images that appear in spa guides at the time. So on the left, there's obviously a very sort of typical romantic imagery of the ruins of the monastery Hagenrode near Alexisbad. And this is a spa guide that actually basically only talks about outings from the spa. And then we have sort of maps like the one from the spa guide of Baden-Baden that shows the River Valley. And you can look for Baden. We can make this a quiz. It's actually in the top right-hand corner there, labeled Baden, but you can see how different the images are from what I showed you before. Next, please. So I'm gonna skip my next 2 points in order to not go too long. There's a very similar development going on with seaside resorts. Obviously, sort of the discovery of the sea and the seaside is going on at the same time. What I sort of looked at was how long seaside resorts are actually modeled on sort of landlocked spas, and how they have to sort of almost contend with this old ideal of spas and have to sort of create their own narrative there. And next, please. And my other sort of point that I'm gonna skip here is sort of this question of the daily routine at a spa, where sort of the idea of combining communal activities with very defined times for individual activities that really are being repeated all over and over again in these spa guides, and that have always reminded me of sort of modern all-inclusive resorts, cruise ships or package trips, where sort of in a potentially open and unregulated space and time are being made predictable to the people who participate in those activities. Next, please. Fifth, the spa as both a discursive space for bourgeois demands for social equality and an actual meeting place. As a social heterotopia, the spa was characterized by a system of opening and closing, which Foucault defines as typical of a heterotopia. There are seemingly open heterotopias that, in fact, hide exclusions. Quote, one thinks one has entered, and by the sole fact of entering, one is excluded. The German spa in the long 18th century was just such a place where all social groups were allowed to enter, but the interior spaces of the spa were, in fact, marked by numerous processes of exclusion. Against this background, the spa served as both an actual space for encounters between the nobility and the upper middle class, and a projection surface for the bourgeois media discourse. In analogy to salons, Masonic lodges, and other institutions of Enlightenment sociability in the 18th century, the spa was defined as a meeting place of the nobility and the bourgeoisie where they could practice new forms of communication and interaction. Or, as Ludwig Christoph Schmidt, a bailiff and councillor in the town of Uffenheim in Ansbach, wrote in his spa diary in 1765, quote, spa guests are like Freemasons, immediately acquainted and familiar. Next, please. Social separation was the norm at the early modern spa, and differences in social rank between the nobility and the bourgeoisie were manifested in access to spaces and participation in leisure activities. Spa guides and personal accounts described the spa as catering to and dominated by the nobility. The bourgeoisie observed but did not participate in noble amusements, and members of the middle class, especially learned men, formed their own circles. Next, please. Around 1750, a gradual change occurred that led to higher levels of interaction between the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Contemporary travel logs and personal narratives not only document this change, but also attest to the enduring social boundaries between the two groups. Next, please. In the late 18th century, the spa became a flashpoint of demands for equality between the nobility and the bourgeoisie. More and more members of the bourgeoisie could afford regular spa visits, which increased their numbers at the spas. But the bourgeoisie's influence went beyond their physical presence at the spas and extended into the published discourse. Spas, which were usually founded by princes and dominated socially by the nobility, were flooded. The published spa discourse soon became preoccupied with Enlightenment ideas of and demands for the formation of new social practices and a new social order. Next, please. Spa freedom became a catchword of this debate, and references to the freedom and equality of life at the spa abounded. These terms encapsulated the idea of the spa as a space where social boundaries could be overcome once and for all. As a result, contemporaries carefully evaluated the so-called tone at each spa. Tone became a shorthand to denote a spa's social atmosphere. The published discourse began to focus on whether the nobility was willing to interact and share leisure spaces like assembly rooms with the bourgeoisie, or instead insisted on maintaining social separation. Accordingly, a spa had either a good or a bad social tone. Next, please. For example, a complaint in the Journal des Luxus und der Moden in 1798 about the spa of Freienwald in Brandenburg that echoed many other similar arguments went like this, quote, "Guests have been as numerous during this year's spa season as during one of the previous ones, but never before has the petition between the nobility, nobles from Brandenburg, Mecklenburg, and Pomerania dominate here, and the bourgeoisie been so ironclad and impenetrable as this time. And while other spas are becoming more and more humanized and popularized, here, noble separation holds its scepter as stiffly as King Solomon on the lion throne in the Nuremberg illustrated Bibles." And I just kind of love this quote because it also, of course, refers to sort of some of the most important cultural accomplishments of imperial cities. And thereby, of course, emphasizes burgher and bourgeois self-confidence. Next, please. The published discourse discussed in great detail the possibilities and limitations of the spa as a socially integrative space in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Three types of discursive statement appeared across different genres of spa publications, and these views are surprisingly consistent with how spa visitors reflected on their experiences in personal narratives. First, some authors forcefully and sometimes aggressively argued for bourgeois equality vis-à-vis the nobility. The nobility was blamed for refusing social integration, and writers focused on the different ways in which the nobility slighted the bourgeoisie at the spa. Next, please. In this context, authors discussed test cases for social integration, from access to leisure spaces and seating arrangements at communal tables, to the choice of dance partners at balls and clothing as a signifier of social rank. Next, please. And this is an example of a spa uniform that the Journal des Luxus und der Moden discussed over several years. And this is one of the sort of proposals to unify female spa dress in order to equalize the nobility and the bourgeoisie in social terms. And you can see the very practical olive color that is being used here. The accompanying article writes that the spa uniform would enable women to engage without any effort in activities like, quote, walking, dancing, driving in a carriage, and riding on horseback, end quote. Second, some authors search for compromise, either by making the case that enlightened members of the nobility were ready to form a new elite with the bourgeoisie, or by constructing individual spas as exclusive heterotopias for the middle class without criticizing the nobility. And third, some very few authors sought to hold the bourgeoisie partially responsible for the perceived lack of social integration at the spas, by claiming that members of the middle class were often too timid in their interactions with the nobility. Despite these differences, all three discursive statements emphasize the Enlightenment demand for social equality. Between the 1770s and the late 1810s, the published spa discourse kept up a consistent drumbeat of demands for social integration. This demonstrates the enduring potency and influence of the Enlightenment that reached into the 19th century. Most of the time, the spa discourse operated through stereotypes and constructed a dichotomy between the nobility on the one hand and the bourgeoisie on the other. These demarcations did, of course, not even remotely reflect the actual social differentiations in late 18th century German society. Rather, as Pierre Bourdieu has observed, such representations enabled, quote, agents to discover within themselves common properties that lie beyond the diversity of particular situations which isolate, divide, and immobilize, and to construct their social identity. By employing a binary social distinction, the published spa discourse appealed directly to the bourgeoisie and helped create a bourgeois identity. At the same time, spa publications used the prevailing discourse about enlightened freedom and equality to broaden their appeal to a wider audience, namely to the enlightened nobility that shared the bourgeoisie's values and participated in the formation of a new enlightened, educated elite. All of this made for excellent propaganda, but even in their personal narratives, contemporaries often describe their fellow spa guests by applying the categories of the published discourse, and nobles were therefore seen as either enlightened or proud, and therefore unenlightened, according to their conduct toward bourgeois spa visitors. This reveals a powerful regime of truth, encompassing both personal perceptions and the published spa discourse. Next, please. Christian, do you want me to shorten this? Can't hear you.
Yeah, this is the last slide, I know. How much time do you need?
I have not checked the time, so I don't know how far I'm going.
Yeah, sort of, I mean, would be time to wrap up, I guess.
Okay, I'm wrapping up. So I'm not gonna sort of go into the details of this. The point is that sort of there are, of course, severe limitations to the construction of the spas, the social heterotopia. There are three major ones. One is sort of that ruling princes are constructed as sort of these friends of the bourgeoisie. There are a circle of friends that successfully integrate the nobility and the bourgeoisie, but you know, they at the same time they kind of show the limits overall of the spa as a social heterotopia. And there are, of course, severe mechanisms of social exclusion that that exclude the lower middle classes, the lower classes, Jews, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into more detail on that. Thank you everybody for listening, and I'm going to turn on my camera now so that I can see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm now in a bit of an uneasy position, having cut off the speaker and suggesting some comments. But thank you very much, Ute, for running us through, I guess, decades of work with an some 40 minutes here, and I think I have the privilege to concentrate on a few points that relate to our project's work, because I think that your presentation of the book has been very clear and very well structured. So I think I don't have to delve back into some of your main theses and main arguments. I guess they have become pretty clear. There are two aspects that I would like to comment on. One of them is comparison, and the other one is chronology. And let me start perhaps with the latter. In terms of chronology, your book is based on a concept of the long 18th century. And as you already described here in your presentation as well, you see an important shift going on, several important shifts going on. You see towards the third, probably third of the 18th century, this kind of shift towards more entertainment, more leisurely kind of practices going on in the spas, with this, and slightly later a kind of new perception of nature and a reconceptualization of the spa, with moving from a more urban kind of decor to integrating nature. I think that's pretty clear. Against this findings, I still wonder why you opted for the long 18th century, because you sort of open up basically with the discussion of the perception and the social roles ascribed to the spa, something which seems to be open-ended. Yeah, sort of the discussion of the expectations of the spas becoming meeting places between the classes seems to be kind of crammed into the last decades of your long 18th century. Would you like to comment on that perhaps first?
Okay, you want me to respond immediately? Okay, that's fine. Well, you know, the point, of course, is that I guess the long 18th century is meant as going into the 19th century in that sense. So what I'm trying to do in the book is I'm trying to describe, and I guess I have to apologize to all the historians who usually operate in German, because my definition, let me turn off my light here, my definition of early modern is really the definition of that's more prevalent in sort of North American historiography that kind of stops around 1700, and then sort of the 18th century is a separate beast, and that's what I mean in my book with early modern. So that is a sort of clarification. My goal in the book is basically to describe what is the sort of legacy, if we will, the established situation at the beginning of the 18th century that is sort of coming out of the early modern period in that definition, and then describe how that changes over well, in that case, long 18th century that runs into the 19th century. I mean, a long 18th century is basically a term that I use in order to help the idea of looking at this in a slightly more longue durée and developmental sense. I'm not in that sense insisting that I have a firm definition of the long 18th century, but it is not going back into the 17th century, it's going into the 19th century. That's basically my point. When you said open-ended, I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. I mean, I see sort of the starting point that I'm trying to describe in the sort of what the legacy of the early modern period left there in the beginning of the 18th century. and then how this very gradually changes in the middle of the 18th century. And you can see that very specifically how these changes come about in the spa discourse. And then for me, it's actually not really open-ended, because I think that there are two things that really do end, and in sort of my two main interests, in the sense that the idea of the the ideal spa being in a rural, mountainous, preferably area, that is established by the time we sort of hit the 1820s. And seaside resorts are established as a new form of summer resort by the time we hit the 1820s. And at the same time, and that sort of, I think is maybe a more open-ended thing. But this idea of the spa as sort of this equivalent of sort of an Enlightenment social space, that ends exactly around that time. That ends in, basically with the Carlsbad degrees, if you will, although, you can never really prove self-censorship in that sense of these spa authors. But so I mean, for me, both do have a very specific ending in the way what I saw in the sources, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, so I was probably thinking more in terms of the institutional developments of the spas rather than the discourse, which is very central to you. And there, obviously, this question of both of the meeting place of the classes remains a very important one, as remains the question of Habermas versus Foucault, right? Sort of what are the mechanisms of in and exclusion? Are they kind of identifiable also in the institutional setup of certain places, sort of ours, which are actually sort of the places that remain half or fully secluded, which are the ones that are more open, and so on and so forth. So lots of stuff that we still do research on for the 19th century.
Yeah, and I think if I may I just make a comment on that? I mean, I think that's really the exciting part, because I mean, what I find is that this very specific Enlightenment discourse that very decidedly goes away in the 1820s. There's a recognition that you will not overcome all these social boundaries at the spa. But I'm looking at what Miriam. I'm blanking on the name. Trundle, is that? I'm blanking on her name right now. Has done. So I mean, clearly, it's there and it can be reactivated all the time. And I'm really interested. I mean, I'm not a 19th century historian per se, and certainly not a 20th century one. But I think that's the fascinating part. When is all of this reactivated again and again, and then how is it reactivated?
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to sort of, I mean, I see the chat is filling with lots of questions, and I don't want to take too much time away, but let me briefly go to the comparative kind of dimension, which was obviously not at the center of your book, but which is very much central for our project. And there are two things that I think are interesting to look at, or at least two things that I want to mention here. The one thing is the entrepreneurship, and you mentioned that in your talk, and it's discussed in more detail in your book, which I can really recommend to everyone when it's out. I've seen the proof, so I'm a bit privileged here. And that's the entrepreneurship of the small princes, of the small principalities in Germany, which seems to be something quite specific. And having started a bit in-depth research in some of the other spas that are obviously not so central for your 18th century, like Bad Wildung, you see that they're very interesting constructions, right? These princes, they create associations in which sort of the municipalities play a role. They sort of farm out the actual management of the places, that kind of thing. That seems to be very interesting, and I'd like to invite you to comment with a few sentences on that, because obviously this is very something that requires almost a very specific kind of political situation of the old empire, right? But has obviously hangovers quite into the 19th century, although we see a lot of changes in Germany across the 19th century.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I totally see that as an expression of the need for small and middling princes in the Holy Roman Empire to basically, to talk with Bourdieu, to convert a spa into sort of a social capital within the realm of the high nobility of the empire. And I think a lot of what happens there, I mean, among other things, that basically they don't really make money with their spas. They often pump money into them, or they spend the money on, when they're, use it as a summer residence, they spend the money that they make. So it's not, it can only be explained in that sense of, as a middling German prince, you can have the kings of Prussia as your visitor, and that is very powerful in that context. I always hesitate with the word entrepreneurship, in the sense that, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, they find ways to obviously include private enterprise, and there are very rare spas like Driburg are actually sort of more entrepreneurial, private entrepreneurial enterprises. But it's still, it is that society. The prince calls the shot, and it's interesting that whenever a town burghers in some spa towns like Kissingen are not that thrilled with the intervention of their prince, and then the prince just favors another spa. So a lot of the successes that you can see in the Holy Roman Empire over the 18th century with certain spas are actually because princes are making very specific decisions which spas to help along, and which they will not help along. And I think that, again, taking it back to my first point, I mean, that just speaks to their interest in terms of having a space for other means as well, for representation, as sort of a noble representation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And my last point, also sort of in a comparative perspective, pertains to one of the main theses of the book, is training the tourist gaze, right? Again, it would seem to me that if you look by comparison to England, there's a whole a bookshelf of literature about the role of the big houses, of the landscape gardens there in training the tourist gaze before the tourists then finally self-discover the Lake District and the rugged kind of Celtic fringe of the British Isles in training that same tourist gaze. And I think Chloe Chard, who's with us, has written on that quite a bit as well herself. So is sort of is this again a kind of very specific German Sonderweg that the spas as a kind of top-down created meeting place between sort of the emerging leisure classes and the bourgeoisie plays a role that is comparable to big houses elsewhere?
Well, I mean, not necessarily in that sense, because I mean, there's Wörlitz after all. And so, I mean, Germany does have not as early as England, obviously, but it does relatively earlier than some of the spas, for sure, have a strong addition of princely sort of landscape gardens. So what I'm trying to do here is to show that this is a popularization. I mean, that's important to me. It's not, I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of elite talk about this already, and it's actually further along, if you will, in terms of seeing the landscape garden as an accomplishment, and you know, princes building them. But the spa discourse is the point where this is almost laboriously communicated to a larger public that is clearly not yet familiar. And that's especially obvious, not exactly with the landscape garden, but later on with the sort of idea of, you know, sort of the discovery of the Alps, and sort of just having a positive gaze on mountains. When you read the spa publications, you can actually see that most people were still not really familiar with that in the 1890s, and they had to be slowly convinced that this is the way to go. And that's where the spa publications really do a lot of work. And I think they do it further down the social scale, in the sense that more people would read spa publications about spas that are, you know, they can't reach themselves. You know, not everybody could go to Carlsbad. But you know, there were those publications were around, and they come in. Like, I should have showed one. They come in these tiny little paperbacks that actually end up being quite cheap. Mm. So I think, you know, it's more of a question of how far and wide things are being spread, not sort of what particular elites do. But you know, and I do see. I mean, for sure, princes in Germany built landscape gardens like the one in Wörlitz, and in other contexts, and spas for sure. So spas are just an extension of that in a way.
Okay, so I see that some of us, our sort of audience, have to leave already, including people that wanted to ask questions. But I think it's high time to hand you over to Anna, who is organizing the discussion by looking at the chat. Anna, please.
Thank you, Christian. My internet is also bad, so I hope it will work. So Alex already left. Yes, okay. So Sophie Vasse had a question first.
So perhaps I think her question was pretty easy. She asked whether there is an English translation of Jean-Paul's novel that you mentioned.
No, there is not. I'd love to have one. I'd love to do one, actually. Not sure I have the time, but yeah, no, there isn't. I've not become aware of one. I did my own translation when I quoted him.
Okay, so now we have a question from Chloe Shah. We can't hear you. Thank you.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
I just wanted to know the title of the novel because I didn't catch it when I was taking notes.
Oh, Dr. Katzenberger, it's a novella, it's not a novel. Dr. Katzenberger's Badereise, so Dr. Katzenberger's spa trip in English. Well, it's not translated though.
Great, thanks.
And then we have a question from Ludmila, so I'm gonna read it. Is there any evidence about spa's role in national building process? Was that change understanding of the idea of spa connected with discussion about national building between different poetic forces?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. You were kind of breaking up for me. Is it written somewhere? Can I look at it?
Yeah, it's on the chat.
Okay.
It's the 1103 question.
Okay, sorry. I guess I should really read them for myself now. Whose question was it? Chloe Shard?
No.
No. Ah, okay, got it. Was there an evidence for role in the national building process? Was that changed? I was saying spot connected with discussions about national. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't it's not a focus of my book, but what I did find, and I thought was really interesting, was that with the sort of, French Revolutionary and then the Napoleonic Wars, you do get increasingly this idea in the spa discourse that when Deutsche spas are being discussed, which includes Carlsbad and the Bohemian spas, that you should not be talking in French, and there's a clear moment there that sort of jives with everything else we know about that time, that makes its way into the spa. But of course, it's much more difficult there, in the sense that people then say, well, if we start forming national circles, and circle is usually a negative word in the spa context, then we're kind of replacing one circle formation that splits up this ideal spa society with another circle formation. So it does happen right at that moment, at the turn of the 19th century. But I have not looked at it. I think that is then sort of that moment after the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, that probably, increasingly sees more of that, but it's not been my focus, but it's there.
Thank you. Then we can move on to the question from Moritz.
Yes, hello Ute, good to see you again. Many years.
Hi.
Last staff meeting we both had the pleasure to attend. Yes, thanks for this great talk, and it's really, really fantastic. Will be a fantastic book very soon. I'm interested in asking a bit about perceptions of time, because what you told us is that there was loads to do in these spas: dancing, networking, hiking towards the end of the 18th century. But it is, of course, less fast-paced than work life for the emerging bourgeoisie increasingly was. So I could see two ways of reacting to that. One could see it as a welcome break from an increasingly fast-paced life as, for instance, an early industrialist, but one can also see a sort of a reaction of boredom. A bit like, there's this book by Martina Kessel on boredom in the 19th century, and I could see sort of the origins of that happening at a spa, that people say, I'm here because a doctor recommended it, or there's certain social pressures I can't ignore, but I'd rather be back at work because this is getting boring. And 3 to 6 weeks in a place like Baden-Baden, maybe that's just me, but it seems a bit hellish even. But is there any this tension between wanting a break, a slower pace, and in a sense getting bored with it? Do you see any of that in especially the eco documents you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, there is that tension. The dietetics discourse that sort of moves into dietetics of the soul discourse in the 18th century. The spa physician, advocates for obviously not having boredom, because that's bad for you, body and soul. There is the tension because a lot of spas actually sort of advertise themselves as a place for the rising bourgeoisie to find what it actually you just talked about, the kind of getting away from your desk and your this sense of Urlaub that really starts right there. But the tensions are never fully discussed in sort of in the sense that they're being brought out. What's happening, and that I find really interesting, and I think it maybe also speaks to our modern perception a little bit, is that spas construct this very, on the one hand, rigid daily routine that has certain times and certain spaces where people do activities together, especially the afternoon outing, the sort of the evening theater. But then it also creates spaces, days, times of the day where people are free to follow sort of their individual activities. And I think that maybe is, so that's part of that, to deal with that tension is sort of to give people space, but also to have them do these communal activities so as to keep that openness and the potential boredom in check by offering these communal activities that are pre-arranged and you know exactly what you're doing. And to me, it's always, it really has always spoken to me in the sense that, I've always ever made individual vacations, but I do think that when we look at how society actually works, there are lots of people out there who want this kind of regularity, and I see that as being invented right there. It's repeated ad nauseum in the spa guides how this works. You would not have been able to go to spa and not know exactly what this would look like beforehand, and that to me speaks to exactly trying to get the tension right, or get the percentages I get right between these things.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I see that Chloe Chart didn't have the opportunity to ask a question, so you can do it now.
Oh, thank you. I was just wondering if you saw any connections between the two main changes that you were tracing, the increased interest in wild nature and the greater demand for social equality. For example, it would seem that the appreciation of landscape as what would be itself socially levelling, because it tends to provide opportunities for claiming prestige through talent rather than birth. Or people might just hope to bump into each other in the landscape, where they'd be kind of experiencing similar problems, practical and physical problems, and also participating in this common aesthetic project. Or is nature itself seen as having a kind of dynamic force of its own? I was just, because they both seem so important, I thought that it was likely that they might interact in some ways.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, because I actually spend a long time feeling not so good about the fact that I did not find that many connections in the spa guides. And we do have, in the existing literature, we almost have the demand for a connection here, in the sense that this landscape garden associated with freedom. We have sort of the idea of the social interaction at the spa associated with freedom. They are occasionally very clearly associated. So, for example, it's actually not quite totally made explicit, but it's in there in the first quote I read to you, Hufeland, where it's like the nature itself creates this space where then this positive social interaction can happen, for example. We then, that goes back to Moritz Fellner's question just now. We have this idea of the spa in the rural surroundings, providing that rest for the exhausted bourgeois who finds the rest in nature and finds the freedom in the spa as a space. So we do have these connections where they are made like very, semantically and explicitly. But I will say the reason for my book being in two parts is that those spa guides most of the time talk about these two things separately. And most of the time they treat one in this chapter and the other one in another chapter. And they're not explicitly interconnected in the same way that I actually expected them to be. And so I decided to represent that in my book, because they're not that often explicitly connected. Obviously, you can always make the argument about, freedom and the discourse on freedom in general. Of course, that's in both. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So Thomas, you had two questions.
Yes, it's reduced to one meanwhile, but perhaps a little longer. You stated that at the end of the 18th century, in a way, the spa started to prepare the people for the Alps by advertising themselves as being situated in a mountainous resort. But now is my question, if you look at those spas you quote about, I mean, the Black Forest, the Giant Mountains aren't really giant, I would say, as an alpinist. They are neatly hills. Are there examples of spas, that doesn't come very much to my mind, which are really situated in the midst of the high mountains of the Alps? Only Mirano in Southern Tyrol comes to mind to me, but as far as I know, it was only in the late 19th century that Mirano developed as a real spa, but perhaps there are other examples. That's my question. Are there examples of new spas in the really high mountains, so not in the Black Forest or in the Sudetian region, which were new, developed in the first half, so to say, of the 19th century?
You're kind of hitting a little past my strict expertise. The spas that I look at are labeled, so just to be clear what I'm talking about, my selection of spas looked at what did the spa guides and the spa compendium call Deutsche spas, which was always excluded spas in the Austrian lands and Swiss spas. Now, they do exist, but for spa goers of the 18th and early, it starts just at the end of my period, where spa guides are being labeled in Deutschland and Schweiz. So you have that, realization that you can look to Switzerland for spas at that moment. Before, when you have the label Deutsche spas, those are the spas that I showed you the map of. And that's important in the sense that I wouldn't call it preparing people for the Alps. It's actually using the Alpine discourse that is sort of out there to describe sort of the Mittelgebirge, and to sort of connect the two as a sort of an attractive way to look at things. And that is a little bit different from sort of, preparing people for the Alps, because at least sort of the advertisements of spa compendia, Deutsche spas, were sort of in the areas that I showed you on my map. They did not go beyond. That changes in the early 19th century.
So in the end of the 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire still existing, the Austrian space were excluded from being German. That's interesting.
Well, Thomas, Bohemia was part of the Austrian Empire as well, right? So
yeah, that's quite right. But I would say, if you say the Austrians are not included, that's very interesting, because Austria was part of the Holy Roman Empire and regarded, I would say, as German, even more as German as Bohemia, I would say.
Well, no, there were so that the strict Austrian Erbländer were not included, but Bohemia was, yes.
Bohemia was, oh,
so it's a very interesting way of looking at the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah. It absolutely is. My personal theory about sort of the Erbländer is that the Austrian spas are really all sort of, except for Baden, are sort of then, and the Swiss spas are in mountainous areas, and that was not yet attractive when I'm looking at the spa discourse. That becomes attractive sort of right at that moment when I finish sort of my book.
Okay.
Just to mention that in our project, obviously one of the questions that is interesting to us is the spread really of the idea of what a mountainous area is, and should look like sort of the proliferation of Switzerland, for example. And you get that, for example, in the areas that Ute described as latecomers or newcomers, like Saxon Switzerland, for example, right? So there you see this kind of intersection, or this adaptation of this alpine discourse in what you as a mountaineer might think is ridiculous hills.
No, ridiculous, but it is Mittelgebirge.
Yeah, but I think we have more questions lining up in the chat.
Okay.
More questions. Christina, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I'm doing research myself on a very small spa in Kleve, which always has the problem that it has been labeled as a boring spa and tries to make the best out of it, sort of setting it itself up as a space of tranquility. So I was particularly interested also in this discussion about boredom. I have actually two questions. Maybe they come across as a little conservative in nature, but I was wondering if you could comment from your longue durée perspective on two aspects that sort of resonate with this question of diversity. First of all, I know your earlier work on sort of the question of secularization and religion, and I was actually wondering if you could say a little more about the role of religion and confession in this period, particularly thinking about sort of the segregation also of Jewish spa visitors then in the 19th century. Could you possibly just, well, I know that's very big and a bit vague, but still I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on this. And possibly this also would go together with this idea of a diversification of spa landscape in the 19th century, which seems to be around as far as I got from the literature. So turning this idea of meeting place into something that probably is a more diverse sort of range of spas. So, and the second question is also quite sort of traditional in nature, but I missed gender a little bit. Could you possibly also, did you find something about it, or is it also a blind spot as it is the connection between nature and sort of visions of equality? Is that something that we would expect and you didn't find, or is it particularly because that would seem sort of very welcome to have a longue durée perspective on the subtle side, where we would expect to find some gender changes sort of underway. So I'd just be curious, and probably I just have to read your book, which I will surely do.
Thank you. I'm starting to write things down, everybody, because during my last answer, I noticed that I am getting a little tired and my focus was wandering. So I think your first question was sort of, you referred to my work on secularization, what I found about sort of religious interactions and especially Jews. I did a little bit on that and then decided not to put it into the book and sort of put it as a, here is sort of what is sort of the basic situation, if you will, in terms of limitations of the spa. And that is very clear that even by the end of the 18th century, Jewish emancipation, and you were thinking about Jewish salons in Berlin, well, at spas, you can, the Jews are the other, and that is palpable. And Jews are not part, except for, very famous Jews, like Moses Mendelssohn in Premont. Jews are basically not thought of as full spa guests. And even in the 18th century, newly built spas built buildings for Jews on the outskirts of the spa. And so there's a clear sense, and it varies. I mean, there's some people have done work on, Jewish women, and there's clearly variety and chances to interact more than they would have been in previous centuries. But, that it's not like the way you really do have these circles of sort of Christian bourgeois and noble members. So there's a clear sense of the other there. In terms of religions, just very quickly, I mean, it's very clear that spas actually very early on are being seen as spaces that should not have, people should not bring in the confessional conflicts of the time. The spa ordinances, even of the 16th century, say that very clearly. If you can't, and spas actually then begin to make this a sort of advertisement in the sense that if a spa is in one of these German areas where you can, go to whatever service on a Sunday, they actually advertise this. But by the 18th century, these people actually, I mean, Sophie Becker goes to Catholic Mass in Karlsbad, and then she talks about it as if she's an anthropologist. But otherwise, going to church is not seen as part of the daily routine anymore. So you do have some very striking changes that I haven't researched in detail, but that I became aware of something that is probably really interesting to look at in more detail. And then, yes, gender is absolutely in there. There's just not so much time in 40 minutes to summarize the book. But I'm actually really interested in gender in terms of the specific interactions that are happening in spas. And that's what I talk about. I talk about sort of this idea of who can ask whom to dance. That has a very, very strong gendered aspect, and you can see it in the ego documents, if I may use the term, of sort of bourgeois women like Sophie Becker and Christiane Vulpius, sort of what types of freedoms they can have at spas that they could not have sort of in their hometowns. So there are some interesting gendered aspects in there that I sort of discuss in the book. So I was, putting more emphasis here on what you call the longue durée. So, but yeah, it's a very, I mean, I think that also could be a whole thing on its own, because it does obviously also create another tension within this noble bourgeois tension at the spa. I'm not going to go into those stories now because I'll be too long, and we can do that when we.
I think it's nearing 3 at night in Phoenix, so probably we should give you a rest after asking you this bunch of questions. So I think many thanks from our sides. Ute, you did a very good advertisement for this forthcoming book, I'm sure. And you could also do an advertisement for your phone and your phone company. So I'm very relieved that it sort of worked for all this time, all bad signs notwithstanding. So we're very happy to have had you here. Thank you very much. I will then sort of close with inviting you for the next and last talk in the spring series on the 18th. We'll have Sophie Vassé, who has been with us today, also talking about the 18th century a bit more. And please stay tuned. We're planning to continue the series in the autumn. We have contacted a number of interesting speakers, so we will venture from Central Europe to Sweden, for example. We're also taking a trip to the Caucasus. So spa life is very vibrant across Europe in history, in the past and in the present. So stay with us, and next talk is with Sophie in 2 weeks' time.
And let me add, Sophie, that you're having a spa lecture as well next week. So maybe you're gonna invite our audience to Paris, because it's gonna be a lecture in the series of Art and Politics in Thermal Town. So for all the others who can't wait for 2 weeks until seeing Sophie going live with us, you have your chance next week already.
Can I say a quick word? I wanted to apologize because I've had to leave for a while. So I think you mentioned my question. I couldn't intervene, so I'm sorry about this. Yes, that talk is actually going to be in Vichy, but it's online really. And there will be some artists talking about a project on the spa walks, and that's on Monday at 4 p.m.
Would you mind to put it quickly into the chat? I think we'll have enough time then, so people could perhaps get a link or
yes,
a reminder.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, doing, as always, some propaganda for our social media activities. Of course, we inform you about the events and lectures by the broader European SPA community on Facebook and Instagram as well. So sometimes you might take a look.
Yes.
So
What's your Facebook page called? I haven't found it.
Oh, it's actually on the flyer, Ute.
Oh, it is. I'm so sorry.
At the end.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's good.
Reading is always a good idea, isn't it? Okay, I will check.
It's good to know that you didn't find it. I'll do a check. It's very unoriginally called the European SPA. But
okay, well, that's...
Sometimes, of course, you come up with some very interesting wellness applications and spa institutions. So that's evident the disadvantage, which might be of interest as well.
And I left my email. If you want to subscribe for the conference, you can just email me and I'll send you the link. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. On this, I suggest that we finish for today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you in particular, for, Ute, for your really great presentation. And looking forward to see you all soon again. I will stop the recording now.